Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Brian David Johnson, who is a professor of practice and director of the Threatcasting Lab at Arizona State University's School for the Future of Innovation in Society, and a Futurist and Fellow at Frost Sullivan, an innovation company that's focused on growth. Brian David Johnson, or BDJ as he likes to be called, works with governments, militaries, trade organizations, and startups to help them envision their future. He has over 40 patents and is the author of a number of books of fiction and nonfiction. He's also directed 2 feature films and is an illustrator and commissioned painter. BDJ, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right. Well, I'm sure that this is question number 1 for most people who get to talk to you. Could you tell our audience a little bit about what a futurist is? And for those youngsters listening, how would they go about, getting a career as a futurist if they're just now finishing high school or college? What's the career path?
Well, John, as a futurist, I work with organizations to look 10 years out into the future. I model both positive and negative futures. And then as an applied futurist, we turn around and look backwards and say, okay, what are the steps we need to take today, tomorrow, 5 years from now to move towards that positive future and move away from the negative future? Basically, we are going and trying to envision these possible futures so that we can either move towards them or we can try to avoid them. And if you want to be a futurist, what I should tell you is come to Arizona State University. You can come and take my classes. That's where we teach it. However, I've been doing this for about 25 years where you really couldn't do that. And for myself, I'm an engineer and a designer by training. And the things that I design take about 5 or 10 years to build. And so for myself, it was very pragmatic that I had to kind of envision these possible futures, whether they be positive or negative, so I could start engineering solutions for them. But I would just say if you're in college or you're going to go to college, come on over to Arizona State University, and I'll talk to your parents and tell them that it can actually be a career.
Outstanding. You can convince mom and dad. Yeah, no, this is legit. This is not something that is going to, put your young son or daughter on the path to poverty.
Yeah, definitely. I have many of my students have gone on to Silicon Valley where they are futurists. Many of them are at banks and also do policy work. And then a lot of them are doing work with the government and military. It's a path sort of directly into doing work for the country.
Okay, fascinating. Well, so curiosity number 2 in the short bio that I read for you there, 40 patents. That's a lot of patents. I would say that's probably above average for most people, even those who have lots of patents. Could you tell us a little bit about how you became part of having 40 patents?
Certainly. I think, John, what you're trying to say very politely is I'm a patent nerd. I
wouldn't say that.
I would say
you're an impressive entrepreneurial mind.
Well, and I also, as you'll see from my enthusiasm, I also teach patents to students and I've actually mentored many a young inventor as well. So yeah, as you can imagine, as I mentioned, so the work that I do looks 10 years out, which is on the other side of the patent window. All right, it usually takes about, depending upon the patent itself, sometimes between 5 to 7 years to move through the process of doing a patent. And what you're trying to do is identify kind of new and novel inventions or processes or technologies. And that's really was my job. For over a decade, I was the chief futurist at the Intel Corporation, the company that makes the chips that goes into all the computers. And it took them 10 years to design, develop, and deploy a chip. So it was of vital business importance for them to know what did people want to do with computers 10 years in the future. And that was my job. So I as a principal engineer and their futurist would kind of say, okay, here's how people would want to act and interact with this technology. And then we would write a requirements document and go about the building of it. Well, we learned if you could do that, well, now you're starting to identify all these new technologies around these computers and new technologies in medicine and new technologies in banking. And so that's what allowed myself and many of my colleagues to be able to start generating a lot of these patents. And then also, I'm a roboticist as well. I make little social robots that actually I build with kids. And through there, that was outside of Intel, was kind of a new and novel area of creating a new way of thinking of and building robots.
Very cool. Very cool. Good for you. So I came across a webinar that you were in, and I had heard about threat casting earlier in this year as well, 2020, and I was really struck by the technique. And there are some, direct line of sight relevance to the Information Professionals Association, to our charter, and to the goals of the Cognitive Crucible podcast, which is to, bring together a whole interdisciplinary conversation of people who are thinking about the problem of information and how it is, we believe the generational challenge that we need to come together and tackle as a whole of society, whole of government. So for starters, I'm hoping that you can tell our audience a little, give some of the background of what threat casting is. If you could perhaps even start with some of the foundational principles, or the history of threat casting, if you will, and its utility even within business, and then we can get into how threat casting can be extremely helpful as we pursue better cognitive security and addressing this growing information threat.
Yeah, definitely, John. It'd be my pleasure. I'm really looking forward to that conversation because I as well agree that information warfare is the problem of our age and needs to be tackled. But for threat casting, the history of threat casting is I invented it about a little over 10 years ago. So the idea of, as we talked earlier, is saying, a lot of what I do looks 10 years out around products or businesses or services. And then I work with organizations, whether it be companies like Intel or in my private practice, to kind of think about, all right, what do we need to do to bring that future about? But what I started seeing, and it was really specifically in the digital domain and sort of with emerging technologies, that we needed to start looking at the threatscape. And so what threat casting does is it takes a broad, multidisciplinary look, everything from social science to technical research to cultural history, economics, trend data, kind of global interviews, and uses them to propel ourselves out to look 10 years in the future to identify new and novel threats. The really potential and possible threats. And then what we do is we backcast and say, okay, well, what are the steps we need to take to disrupt, mitigate, and recover from these new and novel threats? And then we also identify the indicators. We call them flags. What are the red flags that are going to come up that are going to show early on that this threat is beginning to manifest itself? And we don't just do one indicator or flag. We come up with between 5 and 10 because you don't want to respond too early to a threat or too late. And so it really is this way that we inform decision makers, whether they be in private industry or whether they're in government and military, as a way to, number one, get line of sight on threats that maybe in a traditional way, because we are going 10 years out, it allows us a broader range of possible and potential threats to identify some of those maybe threats on the edge, and then get very, very pragmatic, very applied to say, okay, what do we need to do about it? And also who needs to do it? And it really speaks, John, to what you were saying around it brings us together with many different people, not only in the work that we do with subject matter experts and my research, where I'm going to all these multidisciplinary places, which helps us give us that broader range. But oftentimes when we do this, whether it be with private industry and groups or with government and military, we actually do this with practitioners. We bring people together to actually do this modeling. It's a participatory design process where we give them some research and get them thinking about a threat landscape. And because they're practitioners, they start finding the details, and especially in that backcast around disrupt, mitigate, and recover, they're the ones who are actually going to do it. So whether it be terrorism and supply chain, whether it be nuclear proliferation, whether it be cyber warfare or fraud, you name it, by being able to work with these multidisciplinary teams and get them together really allows us to have a much more comprehensive report. But what we've also found, especially at the Threatcasting Lab at Arizona State University, simply convening those people together, getting the chief security officer from the United States Secret Service to sit next to a high-level executive from a Silicon Valley company, and they start having a conversation about a threat landscape. Those sort of interconnections, which normally wouldn't happen in their daily lives, actually becomes a really robust conversation. And that's one of the things that people have told us that they also really like is when we do this, oftentimes we do it in the desert down at Arizona State. And we try to create a really safe space because we are doing some work that is quite dark. And so we tell people that it's the dress code is mandatory casual, flip-flops encouraged. And I like to tell people, you may not agree with somebody, and we encourage people to disagree because this is the conflict of thought and ideas is really important when you're modeling these threat spaces, and especially what we need to do to disrupt, mitigate, and recover from them. But we like to say it's really hard to get in a really deep argument with somebody when you can see each other's toes.
That's good. Yeah, I love the inherent interdisciplinary nature of these projects. I'm curious, over the last, say, 10 years, as this has been evolving, I can imagine a time, I have a military background, when these types of projects where you need to get people from all portions of the command or the business unit, you need to get like a heterogeneous mix of cats and dogs who may not naturally flock together in their daily business lives. When you get them together, there's a whole bunch of eye rolling, like, I can't believe this. I mean, this is stupid. This is a waste of my time. I mean, I can almost feel people saying those types of things maybe 10, 20 years ago. But I'm kind of leading the question here, but I'm hoping that you're discovering today during these types of projects that there's a lot more enthusiasm or receptivity to the positive outcome, would you say?
I would say I couldn't agree more. That's as you were speaking, that's exactly what I was thinking. As when I was first developing this methodology, there was a lot of pushback, and there was just a lot of pushback even to this futures type work. But trying to get those folks in the room was a little bit tough. And I was very fortunate early on. Certainly, coming out of industry and coming out of Silicon Valley, which was a little more receptive to this because it was a business. It was a business necessity, really. This wasn't a hey, wouldn't this be cool? No, this was the bottom line. So it was a business necessity. But then, oftentimes my on-ramp into sort of government and military would have been through some of the organizations that maybe were at the leading edge of this. So, my original place where I was prototyping this was at the United States Air Force Academy. So kind of doing work with the cadets there and sort of training some of those cadets, but then also working with their innovation center was a way to kind of do this, but it was also in an academic setting. And then also working with places like the Government Accountability Office. So the GAO has a mandate from Congress to do foresight. Not only their other watchdog, but they also, so it's kind of their job to do this as well. And so early on, I had some places that were very receptive and met some very, very passionate people who sort of supported this. But you couldn't be more correct, John. I'm floored, especially over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, really seeing at all levels. I'm surprised when I walk in the room to brief out a general, whether it be any of the branches or of going to the NSA or going in any of these places and starting to talk about this and still kind of carrying a little bit of the baggage of trying to, having those arguments many years ago, and they're all in. And to the point where we have, in those flip-flops and a lot of this, we have generals, right? We have folks who are doing work, and we've got some great supporters. But I'll tell you, one of the things that really flips them in the best way is when they are a part of this and they're slightly open-minded and they're there, but they still might be a little bit skeptical, which we like skeptics. We're big fans of that. As I said, I'm an engineer. I like disagreeing with people. That's important. But we'll do the modeling and we'll find these threat sets and we'll find those those indicators I told you about. And I've seen it happen time and time again, whether it be in private industry and business or with the folks that I do work in government with, is when one of those early indicators happens and you see it on their faces. There's a general in the Army, and I have a clear moment. I was up at West Point and he pulled me aside. He was a big fella. He's retired now. And he was like, BDJ, we had done this. We were looking at this intersection between cyber warfare, terrorism, and supply chain. And some of the early indicators that we had talked about, 6 months later, one of them happened. And he kind of looked at me and his BDJ, it happened. I was like, well, yes, sir, I know. That's why we do this. And he's like, and we know what to do. And I was like, yes, that's why we're here. And it was, you begin to see that this sort of pragmatic approach, founded in interdisciplinary, founded in sort of creativity, but goes back to pragmatism and ultimately national security, really, I think, is starting to take hold. And I've been overwhelmed by it and really humbled by it.
Yeah, that's cool stuff. So you mentioned West Point, so let's just hop up there. So you at ASU, the Threatcasting Lab has done a number of threat casting projects with the Army Cyber Institute, which is co-located there at West Point. Could you talk a little bit about some of those projects, and then I definitely want to focus on your most recent project, which is a stunning graphic novella, and I know you've done a number of graphic novellas, but Invisible Force, which is all about information warfare. But that's not the only thing you've done with the Army Cyber Institute, I don't believe.
Yeah, so I have again, long history with certainly West Point, and have done sort of lecturing there and done work there. But the Army Cyber Institute is a think tank. They're attached to West Point, and it's their charter to look 10 years out and guard against strategic surprise for the Army in the cyber domain. So as you can imagine, when we met, it was a quick and fast friendship. And it was a way for me to take the methodology of threat casting and very early on to work with them in their research and the work that we're doing. So we've had a very long and fruitful partnership, and they have civilians and active duty soldiers. They're all academics. And so there is this mix of sort of academic research work and also sort of pragmatic application as well. And so we have a long relationship with them. And we've looked at many things. The project that I mentioned around cyber warfare and supply chain and terrorist attacks was one of the ones that we did with them. We've done work looking at the weaponization of artificial intelligence. And as you said, we've just wrapped up doing this really multi-year threat casting, where we've done multiple threat casting sessions and also backcasting sessions, and have had multiple reports looking at information warfare. Again, this very large problem that sits in front of us. And I'm glad you mentioned the graphic novel. So the graphic novels are something based on what's called sci-fi prototyping. Sci-fi prototyping is a process that I invented many, many years ago and sort of wrote a textbook on it and did things like that, where it's using science fiction based on science fact to show people and think about and prototype the future. I had originally done it for products. I'd done it for, okay, what would a product look like in the future? How would people experience it? And if you could show somebody a graphic novel or a comic book, or if you could give somebody a science fiction story, they would understand it much quicker than reading a specification. So it was a great shorthand way to get people to understand what we were talking about, but also grasp the gravity of the situation. And so we sort of use this, and I've used this as a tool in all walks of the work that I've done. And very early on, the Army Cyber Institute, and actually the Army, and to be quite honest, all branches, and many people inside the DoD latched onto it really quickly, because there's a history, specifically in the Army, of using graphics and comics as a way to get information across very quickly. And so we use these graphic novels as a way to say, well, here is a very visceral way of understanding how this threat might manifest itself. And then you can go back, and every single panel or every single sentence is actually based on these threat casting reports, these really deep research. So the graphic novels can be anywhere between, 20, 30 pages. Sometimes they're just 4 pages, but then they go back to these like very dense technical reports that sort of show the work that we're doing in the threat casting lab. So they've been a very, very surprising tool to really get out there. And that's why Invisible Force was just released a couple of weeks ago, and it's already started to gain some interest. So it's been great.
Yeah, cool. I didn't realize that the Army, or DoD, for that matter, has a history. I think you said of using. This is my word, not your word. I don't think cartoons or to communicate points that are of interest, teaching points. I was thinking that these graphic novellas are, in addition to everything you said, it's a way of connecting these kinds of educational points with a younger generation of service members who tend to appreciate that communication vehicle more so than reading a PowerPoint slides which try to communicate the same thing.
Yeah, and both those are true. That it's used up at West Point. It's actually used at all the academies now. Use it as a way to queue up ideas to the student body, to really get them, again, to thinking very viscerally. We did one that's taught down at the Naval Academy. It's called Hero. And again, it's all on our website, the lab's website. None of this is classified or confidential. And the work that we've done, this hero work, was looking at the miniaturization of artificial intelligence and robotics and what it might mean for surveillance and security. And they use it to kick off a class. And so that they show the graphic novel and they use that, and then they kind of dive into the perils and dive into the promise of what might happen. And then at the end, they use it to kind of assess what they've learned. So you're right. It's this really interesting on-ramp to get folks in. But yeah, the tradition goes back really. And if you look at, there's one of the graphic novels that we did is called Dark Hammer, which was a previous one that we did. And in the introduction, there's a great introduction written by a different futurist by the name of Greg Lindsay. And Greg actually talks a little bit about that history. It actually goes back to World War II, where you had a lot of people who maybe didn't have a full certainly not college education or high school education coming into the ranks, and you have to teach them how to fix your Jeep or how to clean your gun. So they would actually use cartoons or use illustrations as a way of doing that. So the Army became really comfortable kind of using that, and it goes to this sort of deep tradition. And so most of those folks will kind of come very quickly go, oh yeah, it's just like this. And so they'll kind of talk about it. And if people are interested in it, there's a really great profile that Greg Lindsay does in the introduction to Dark Hammer.
Oh, okay. Very good. And yes, of course, we will put links up to all of these resources in the show notes. So I'm hoping that you could maybe sketch out a couple of the main points that are unfold in the Invisible Force graphic novella. It seems like we're talking about a dystopian future 10 years from now, very plausible, with a very, very visceral military focus to it. But could you kind of sketch out the story a little bit?
Certainly, yeah. And so the whole idea behind it, as I mentioned, is based on this threat-casting report. And the threat-casting report is called Information Warfare and the Future of Conflict. And so, and what we're looking at is, the really central push of the threat-casting work that we did around this was that the very nature of conflict is changing. That it's how the character of conflict is changing. And so, what we're saying is that you'll have the cognitive domain, you'll have the digital domain, and you'll have the physical domain. And conflict will slip between all of those domains, and it will move very quickly, so that when you are in conflict, you will be attacked by adversaries in all of these domains almost simultaneously. And so the goal of Invisible Force was to show what that would look like. And so what we do is we sort of show how information warfare would play out on a global stage. Now, certainly it's fictional. And so it takes place in some fictional areas that anybody with a sort of military background will recognize as kind of very specific areas with the Atropians and the Denovians. And so the idea is that it is a fiction. And so it looks out and says, okay, if we're going and saying, what would that look like? It's looking at a set of deployed soldiers in a conflict zone, and watching how the adversary uses information warfare, uses the cognitive space, uses the digital space to affect civilians, to affect and maybe attack family members of deployed soldiers, to affect local relations, but then also to affect the homeland, to affect support there, and to be able to, both with the public and with policymakers, and then also with our allies, to use the different aspects of information warfare as a way to erode support. And so it really plays out over a rather short period of time to show how an adversary could use this threat space in multiple ways to really begin to erode the support, both in the homeland, at home, as well as with our adversaries, and also even locally on the ground with a deployed force, what that could do. And ultimately, what we're queuing up is, there's not a lot of answers in this. I would like to tell your audience, there's not a lot of answers, John. What we're trying to do, though, is distill the problem, to say, okay, what are the specific problems that we need to start thinking about, to start doing more research on, to start talking to people about. And that was our goal, was to really queue those up at the end of it. And then as your listeners will see, throughout the graphic novel, there's nonfiction pieces. So we take a pause and we bring in experts who are doing work in specific areas, maybe around reflexive control, or work around sort of understanding sort of what the adversaries might be doing, or understanding information warfare tactics of adversaries. We brought them in and quoted their work and used them to give us pieces so that they could give a little bit more background. And then if the reader wants to know a little bit more, certainly they can look at the end notes and go and get more information. But the whole idea then at the end is to queue up these questions so that people can start talking about them. And then ultimately, a lot of not the answers, but a lot of okay, what could we do? What could we do to disrupt, mitigate, or possibly recover from these things is in that threat casting report.
Well, it's a fascinating and brilliantly put together product that everybody should go and check out. I want to switch gears just a little bit. During the podcast, I like to ask all of the guests if they are aware of any books or other resources that interested audience members can go and check out, which might be somehow related to everything that we've been talking about.
Certainly. So there's two, John, I'd like to recommend. The first is a new book. It just came out. It is called Burn In. It's written by P.W. Singer and August Cole. Many of your listeners may know them. They wrote Ghost Fleet. Again, it's a science fiction story based on fact. These two are amazing researchers, to full transparency, they are friends of mine, and they also wrote the introduction to Invisible Force. So these do kind of tie together, but it's a really, really great work of not only sort of science fiction prototyping and kind of thinking of what the future might look like, but of scholarship as well. These two authors are notorious for having endnotes that are almost as long as the novel itself. So it's a really great resource in understanding what the future of conflict might look like. So again, that's called Burn In by P.W. Singer and August Cole, and it was just out. So a great work. But then another one that your listeners may not have heard of, and it's one that I use in all of my classes. It's the first book that all of my students have to read. So you can imagine you come to Arizona State University and here's this futurist, and you want to be a futurist, or you want to do work in foresight, sort of thinking about the future, and you're really excited. And I give you this book. This book is called Future Babble. It's written by Dan Gardner. And Future Babble is a scathing indictment of all things futurist and futures oriented. It shows the failures and where people got it really wrong. And Dan's a great writer and a journalist as well. So it's very well researched and just shows you all the perils of thinking like this and what could go wrong. But at the very end, he does say, but we still need to do this. Oftentimes we do need to think about the future. We need to think about the positive and negatives because we need to be prepared for them. So as I tell my students, if not us, then who? So we have to do this work, but there's some really great tips that he gives. And oftentimes it's what I teach students, that as we do this work, what are some things that he had learned? How do we approach this type of work, this type of thinking? And the biggest one that I teach my students is humility. That when you do this type of work and you think about this, to be humble, that it's not your job to make predictions. It's not your job to be the smartest person in the room or to be right, that it's our job to get it right. And especially if we're doing work around information warfare and security, it's our work so that we're helping organizations to be prepared for these futures. And that's really what we should do. And we need to approach it with all that humility and this idea that we can't do it alone.
Well, it sounds like the Future Babble book is not only required reading for your students, but back to the beginning of the discussion, anybody who's thinking of a career in as a futurist, that's required reading for them and for their parents, probably, to understand what they may be getting into and how to do it right and to avoid some of the pitfalls from those who have gone before in the futurist job world.
Yeah, definitely. What a lot of people don't realize, they think that futurists and historians are like cats and dogs, that we don't really get along, but actually the history is incredibly important. History is the on-ramp to the future and sort of understanding that and sort of that language. And so, yeah, I think understanding history is always very important when you're working for the future.
Oh, wow, that's a great connection. One of my favorite sayings is, I think it's attributed to Samuel Clemens, is that the history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I wonder if that is. I mean, that sounds like it fits nicely into being able to gaze into possible futures and using the past as a way to inform those types of examinations.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's a great cultural historian who I've done work with. I've actually written a book with him by the names of he's called James Carrot. And what James will tell you is that the history doesn't repeat itself, but history is the language that we use to talk about the future. And so we need to be well-versed in that language.
Good stuff. Brian David Johnson, BDJ, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible, and I hope that you will come back again sometime in the future.
Thank you so much, John. It was a pleasure being here, and I look forward to coming back and chatting some more.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.